Welcome back to another episode of the MMA Beat. It is Thursday, August 20th, 2015. Hello again, everyone. I'm Ariel Helwani in our New York City studio. Today on the show, we're being joined by the new kid on the block, a familiar face who is back in the game. Mike Chiappetta, a fellow beater, if you will, an original beater. The newest member of the BleacherReport.com team, Mike Chiappetta, is here. Welcome back, my friend.
Thank you. I'm sorry to all you Luke Thomas fans. I'm sure I'm going to get some hate mail and hate tweets, but I couldn't grow a beard on short notice either.
You look great.
I'll do the best I can.
Tan, svelte as always. Luke Thomas is nursing an injured back, so we wish him a speedy recovery. Luke, get well soon.
Not me. I want to come back next week. Just kidding, Luke.
That is the man in the shirt, Jeff Wagenheim of SportsIllustrated.com, and of course, the man in the hat, Chuck Mindenhall, anchoring the show, also of MMAfighting.com. All right, guys, let's talk some mixed martial arts. The big news this week, in my opinion, the official announcement of UFC 193, November 15th, 14th here in America, 15th in Melbourne, Australia. It's going to be at Etihad Stadium, and they're gunning for 70,000 fans. Now, this would, of course, be a UFC record. The record right now is 55,000 plus. Toronto's Rogers Center was the Sky Dome. Now it's the Rogers Center, UFC 129, April 30th, 2011.
To be specific.
Yes, the main event is Carlos Condit versus Robbie Lawler. There's also Mark Hunt versus Bigfoot Silva 2, Michael Bisping versus Robert Whittaker. Those are the three big fights as of right now. What do you make of the UFC's decision to take that particular card to a 70,000 seat stadium?
Well, as we know, Australia is an important market for them. When you look at this card so far on paper, I don't know that it's stadium worthy, but certainly there's a lot of time to go. So hopefully they can round it out. As it starts, I mean, I can't have a bigger man crush on the main event. Carlos Condit, possibly my favorite fighter to watch ever. I just think he's...
Why?
Just when you talk about an action fighter, like to me, he's the epitome of a fighter's fighter. Like all he ever does is come to finish. He's no matter where he is in the fight, whether he's standing, whether he's in the clinch, whether he's on the ground, he is always moving, trying to better his position, trying to finish his opponent. Whether he's trailing on the scorecards or whether he's comfortably ahead, he's still trying to finish. And to me, that's what I'm always looking for, someone who's trying to be decisive in what he does. And Robbie Lawler is the same kind of guy. I mean, what an amazing career revival, but really the same kind of attitude, if not the same game. It's a different game, but you know, when you put them together, the contrast of styles, but just the ferocity that both guys bring, I mean, you couldn't ask for a better action fight. Now, in terms of headliners for a stadium show that they want to draw 70,000 people, you know, I don't know. To me, that's a little bit of a tall order, but they do have time to fill out the card. We'll see.
Yeah, well, the biggest star in the UFC is, of course, the UFC. I mean, we've seen it since they've started this, the uniform, or I guess we should say fighter kit thing, where now all the guys walk in and they all have the UFC emblazoned on their chest in big letters, and they all, and they've been fostering that for pretty much for as long as we've been watching the sport. The UFC has always had stars, but the UFC itself has been a big star. So when the UFC brings its show down to Melbourne, I guess they're also banking on just that big bang of making that first shot in that spot. They're gonna just draw tremendous numbers, and even if the card were to go as is, there's enough good names that they're gonna and that great main event, to draw a lot of people.
I will slightly disagree with you. I think up until maybe end of last year, the UFC was always positioned as the big draw. The star, the company, those three letters more important than anything. But I'd say right now Ronda Rousey is a bigger name than the UFC.
Right.
And I also feel
she's not
like
fighting on that.
No, but my point is I feel like there's actually been a shift in the way they presented that. Like I feel like they've been pushing fighters more. You know, you even see Dana White taking a bit of a step back, more so than the actual organization. But I agree with your point that usually when the UFC comes to a town, to a market for the first time, just them coming is enough for that debut show, and I think they're banking on that as well.
That's 100% what I was going to say. Is essentially, I mean, the same thing with Toronto. When they were going to go to Toronto, they knew they could do it in a 55,000 seat stadium. Of course, they had Georges St. Pierre. They normally try to position these things where there is some kind of local tie or some kind of indigenous draw, I guess, like Georges St. Pierre being Canadian, that sort of thing. This particular one, I don't think there's really any great option that way. But then you get, like you just said, I think that's probably one of the more fan-friendly fights you could actually put at the top of the card with a belt attached to it. And that's going to draw a lot of excitement. I think that the fans out there, if you go off of what we hear about how you both have been to Australia, you've seen the live crowds there, but if Melbourne is really behind it like they're saying, I think that it doesn't matter so much if it's the most gussied up card of all time. It just might matter that they're there and they're putting on good fights. It doesn't hurt, though, that other Australia card that you were at, where Hunt and Bigfoot went to war on that fight, ended in a draw, is actually your co-main event. I feel like that's a big deal for that particular card and perfect placement.
Yeah, Australia has been a hot market for the UFC, and typically, even though their cards will take place on like a Sunday afternoon, if it's a Saturday night card here, they get pretty good crowds for the most part. But it always felt like Melbourne was the one that they were holding out for. There was this ban on cage fighting for so long, and credit to Tom Wright, who, by the way, in his back pocket on his resume, he opened the door in Ontario, 55,000, and he opened the door in Melbourne. I mean, that guy from Toronto, former CFL commissioner, made many trips to Victoria to try to get this ban lifted. He did so successfully, and now here he is.
Has he ever made a trek out to New York by chance?
He hasn't, but maybe they should call upon him. Not to say that Mark Ratner isn't qualified enough to do that, but that's pretty cool for a nice feather in Tom Wright's cap. You were there, as Chuck just mentioned, when Hunt fought Bigfoot for the first time. That was in
December of 2013.
But what was was it Brisbane?
It was in Brisbane, yes.
Brisbane. Tremendous fight, arguably one of the greatest UFC fights of all time, greatest heavyweight fight of all time. What was the reaction to that? And do you feel like, sometimes you have a great fight, a legendary fight, and you don't want to run it back?
Yeah.
I think of Bonner Griffin. Are you okay with this idea?
I didn't love it just because, to me, I almost feel like the purity of what they did the first time, steroids aside, I almost feel like it should just kind of stand on its own, because I almost feel like fights like that, there's no need for a rematch unless there's some real tangible stakes behind it, and in this case there is none. Now, there are stakes for the UFC. They're trying to fill a huge stadium, so obviously there's these memories that go along. Australian people, this is something that happened in their country, and maybe that'll spur them on to buy tickets if they're not sure about the rest of the card.
And
remember how great,
Australia.
of course, and that was such a great fight. Of course, we want to see the rematch, but there's a big jump. I mean, that stadium or that arena was probably 12 to 15,000 people, I would guess. Great lively crowd. I mean, Australians love fighting, and it was an awesome experience. That was the first time I was ever at a daytime event.
Yeah.
A little bit surreal, but super fun. I mean, the really lively crowd, and it was a great experience. So there's just a big jump from 15,000 to 70,000, and is that going to be enough? I mean, I guess what they're banking on is there's this countercultural thing to people being told no all the time. You can't have this here. You can't have this in our town. And it finally comes, and you want to be like, F you to the government. I'm going to that card. So we'll see if that's kind of a draw on its own.
I don't mind the rematch this time because it ended in a draw. There's actually actually a point to the whole thing. Like, I actually want to see who's the better man.
For the other, it was a no contest.
That's a weird.
It's brilliant in some ways. It's really smart matchmaking, regardless of what you thought. As long as you saw that fight as a good fight the first time, which I think everybody did, it's perfect, because when you really look at both guys, and each of them in their last 5 fights is 1-3-1, but it's the one at the end that they sort of put together that fight. And in terms of marketability, what can we do with these two guys? To put them together in that setting is probably the most perfect scenario for those two guys.
Yeah, there's probably not a better option for either one of them. So while I agree with you that sometimes you want to preserve the memory of some great fight. I mean, we could tick off probably half a dozen of them. That the first one was really amazing, and the second one was not so much. But a lot of times those second ones kind of destroyed the momentum that one of the guys had towards something greater. In this case, I don't think that's the case. I think these guys are just meant to take on each other.
And it's already sort of tainted, like you mentioned. I mean, we wanted so badly for it to be as poetic as it seemed. Like, it seemed poetic at the time, like, wow, it ends in a draw. Of course it did. That's the most perfect scenario that could have happened in this fight. Dana White was having custom-made shirts from the Roots of Fight, about this fight and everything else. It sort of, as soon as you threw that asterisk on it, it sort of lost a little something. So, in that alone, I don't know.
You can't blame them for wanting to sort of recreate the magic a little bit, because going to that fight, I remember being there and just like, I don't think there was a lot of expectation about it. It was more like, oh, the UFC's in Brisbane, it's an event, let's go. But I don't think there was a lot of expectation about what the fight would be, because, let's face it, I mean, Mark Hunt, he has a reputation for being an exciting fighter. Bigfoot sort of feast or famine. I think a lot of people thought that fight would be over in about 2 or 3 minutes, right? And so all of a sudden it turned into this sort of like rollicking event where the momentum was shifting. And that that never happens in heavyweight fights. It's usually like one guy takes control and either knocks the other guy out or just dominates him for 5 rounds or 3 rounds, whatever the fight is. But in this fight, I mean, there was so many like peaks and valleys to it, and that's what made it really special.
Like Arlovsky Brown spread over a whole fight.
Exactly, and like, I mean, it's hard to expect them to sort of recreate that, but if it gets anywhere close, I guess it will have been worthwhile.
I don't think we are qualified to talk about what kind of a market Melbourne is. None of us have been there. We don't know, what their interests are. But just consuming their media over the last couple of days, A, the media seems very excited about this. B, seem very confident that they are going to break the record. And they have this sort of idea, which I touched on Twitter, that they are the sporting capital of the world. They keep pushing this. They keep saying, this is where the biggest stars come to play. This is where the biggest events happen, which seems a little bit insecure.
They have it in New York? No?
Yeah, it seems a little bit of an insecure statement. One particular radio show was touting the fact and reporting the fact that Ronda Rousey was going to be on the card and say, look, this is where the biggest stars come to play. I guess ignoring the fact that she's fought, in the United States and all that stuff, she is not going to be on the card, according to Dana White. Although, you wonder, is this the kind of card that needs, 2 title fights? Because here's the thing about Condit and Lawler. It's a great fight if you know who these guys are. It's a great fight if you know about their history. But they're not going to do a lot of media. They're not going to go out of their way like Conor and Ronda to really sell this thing. So they are maybe banking on the 3 letters in this one.
Well, sure, but you also, the stuff you just talked about can be bigger than what it seems. Like once the media and the fans and the community gets behind this idea that we're going to break the record, it kind of takes on a life of its own.
True.
You could put out, as long as you have something that's a reasonably good card that people are willing to go to, which they certainly have. Then it just goes on its own momentum because everybody wants to break the record. It's not just, hey, the UFC is here, I want to see the fights. Let's break the record. We're the sporting capital of the world. Look, we're going to show everybody.
Yeah, but look what they gave fans in Toronto to draw 55,000. They gave you George St. Pierre in a title fight. They gave you a second title fight with Jose Aldo and Mark Hominick, and Randy Couture's last fight against Lyoto Machida, which was a pretty impressive matchup on its own. So they were throwing a lot of. I remember even the undercard was like stacked.
Rory McDonald, Nate Diaz.
Yes, absolutely.
That's also a community that had UFC fights before, and if you could have just gone to Montreal, you could have gone to, there were a lot of UFC fights within close proximity before that. So they really did need to do something special in Toronto.
Yeah.
Here, it's its own world in a sense.
I think to ask people to pay for a seat that's like way up 70,000, nosebleed seats for lack of a better term. Not a great view. So you have to give people something. You have to give them an event. You have to give them something that they know they're going to walk away from like, God, I'm glad I bought the ticket. I knew I had to be there, and it was worthwhile.
Why do you love this main event so much? I saw you tweet that this is like your dream fight. You've been thinking about this for a long time?
Yeah.
You're speechless.
I wouldn't go that far. I haven't been fantasizing about it or anything. Let's not get too crazy. But
that's cool. I'm down.
No, I've like I said, Carlos Condit has always been like my favorite guy to watch fight. I just love the way the guy competes. And Robbie Lawler is just like, you thought this guy we left him for dead on the MMA highway a long time ago. He's always had that same mentality of like, I'm either kill or be killed, but you just never thought he'd get back to what he is now. And so to get this fight between 2 guys who've been doing it for so long, doing it so well for so long, I feel like it's almost a gift to the MMA world. I really do. I'm giddy, man.
Robbie Lawler went 5 rounds with Rory McDonald in that fight. 5 rounds, 25 minutes with Johnny Hendricks twice. Went 5 rounds with Matt Brown. This guy has been in the cage for a very long time over the past year and change. So it's going to be interesting. And Condit's that same kind of fighter. So, if you know who they are, it's tremendous. And you also have Michael Bisping. I want to ask you about this because one of the nice stories I think of this year has been, remember end of November, Rockhold submits Bisping in Australia, by the way. Bisping has ties to Australia. His wife is from there, so he's a nice draw there as well. Remember that fight against Jorge Rivera at UFC 127, which was a big deal because of their whole back and forth.
Wish we could see that video. Cue the video.
Yes, guys on the truck. So anyway, you have Bisping, who, speaking of left for dead, I kind of felt like a lot of people after that submission, his first submission loss, kind of thought, all right, this is the end of the road for Michael Bisping. Comes back against CB Dalloway, tough, gritty win, and does the same against Taos Ladies, and all of a sudden, you're kind of sensing that he's got one more run left in him. I noted, I think on this show and other places as well, that I'd give him one more fight. If he wins that fight, he should get a title shot just because of his longevity, just because of what he's done. He's had some bad draws here and there, but in this day and age, a lot of other people have gotten title shots for doing a whole lot less than what Michael Bisping has done. But he gets Robert Whittaker, who wasn't the kind of opponent I had in mind. I was thinking a Vitor Belfort type of guy. How do you feel about this matchup? I get it for the market, Whittaker being Australian and Bisping having his ties, but for his journey here to the title.
Chuck told me before the show, this is his Conor Lawler.
This is your fight. Okay, well, it's great.
Rather than expound on that, though, I was a little bit surprised, to be honest. I mean, and it was sort of snuck in there too. Just we're going to take 70,000. By the way, we got Michael Bisping and Robert Whittaker. I don't know. I don't know what to quite make of that. I know that Bisping has fought in Australia a couple of times. They probably think like just having him on the card is a good idea to sort of fill that space that you're saying, kind of deepen the card a little bit. It's really more of a showcase or an opportunity for Whittaker because he's fighting in front of his hometown, in his home country, and he has a chance to beat a guy like that who's a perennial top 10 or sometimes gets into that top 5 space. So it's an interesting fight, I guess, but more so, I think, from Whittaker's standpoint than what you're saying, which I thought they might do as well, which was kind of position Bisping to get one more win to potentially have him fight for the title. Exactly what you said, 100%. Because I've seen a lot of fans clamoring for it, and a lot of times when like you said, it's more of like an overall arc of his merit, his merit in the sport. I'm not sure that a win over Whittaker, regardless of how he does it, gets him there. So in some ways, I look at it as a little bit of a sideways motion for him. But at the same time, if he's being a company man by taking the fight, good for him. Maybe they needed him for this space.
I mean, I would maybe agree with you that beating Robert Whittaker might not be the step up that Bisping needs in order to deserve a title shot when we're looking at this as a meritocracy. But I think that the UFC has shown again and again that when it sees a fight that it wants to put on, it's going to do it. And if Bisping goes out there and remember his last 2 wins have been pretty tight affairs. If he goes out there against this guy and puts on a shining performance, I've seen guys get title shots for less.
That is true. Yeah, Alexander Gustafsson's getting one coming off a knockout loss. Frankie Edgar against Matt Beach.
Matt Beach. Wow, Matt Beach reference on the MMA Beat.
I always reference
And
Matt
for
Beach.
the market, a local guy, so to speak, fighting a guy like Bisping, who will probably do more selling of this card than anyone else, right? Yeah. Just based off his interviews and all that.
Where is Whittaker from, though? What part of Australia? I mean, that's a fairly large piece of geography.
It's right somewhere.
George St. Pierre wasn't from Toronto.
Us Americans, we tend to think of Australia as like Rhode Island.
I know. But it's.
I understand what you're
if
saying.
Robert Whittaker entered the Olympics, he'd be representing Australia.
Yes,
That's all you really need to know. What's that passport say? So this is going to be the first UFC stadium show. There have only been 2, Sweden and Stockholm and Toronto, that will not be main evented by a local draw, so to speak. Sweden had Gustafsson, Toronto had George St. Pierre, so it's going to be interesting, but I have a feeling since they've been talking about this for the last year, they really have been talking about this for a whole year, they've done their due diligence. They know what to expect. They're not going to go into this blindly. They feel pretty confident they're going to break the record. We shall see. Let's talk about UFC 194 for a second because it continues to get deeper, that card. They just added Yoel Romero versus Jacare Souza, which is an amazing fight. It makes total sense from a booking standpoint, although it is the 3rd time they've tried to make this fight, so we'll see if it actually happens. But also you have the middleweight title on the line on that card, Weidman versus Rockhold. So hopefully not if someone gets injured, one of those guys could step in. But I kind of feel like that Weidman-Rockhold fight is our version of Bird versus Magic. I feel like that fight, to me, is more intriguing at this point than McGregor-Aldo. I don't know what it is about these guys. These 2 young studs who have this rivalry with each other, and you see it continuing to build. Like, they first liked each other, they tolerated each other, but now you get the sense that they are increasingly getting annoyed of each other. They don't want to lose. There's just something about those 2 guys fighting each other at this juncture. Like Anderson was Dr. J. You know what I'm saying? This is Bird versus Magic.
I love the Bird Magic analogy because those guys, Bird and Magic loved each other in a kind of a way. They were very, very close in a kind of way, but because they cared about each other, they did not want to ever lose to each other. I'm not saying that Weidman and Rockhold have that close of a relationship, but they do have a generally cordial relationship. They've described each other as friends. And even, in some ways, you don't want to lose to that guy even more than losing against some guy who you just can't stand. And I also think that I get the same kind of feeling, that the same like goosebumps that you were having when you're talking about the Condit fight. I sort of get that with this one because I think these guys both are it's rare that you see two people who have risen to what we think may be the peak, but maybe there's even more of a peak, and they're really both at that place. And we're going to see it.
Greatest co-main in UFC history, whatever that means.
I would agree with that. This is one of those fights, too, that you look at, all three of those fights that you mentioned, it's a lot of heads and momentum coming together. It's one of those unique situations where you're like, somebody has to lose. Three of these guys, there's going to be a novelty in play that three of these guys will lose. None of these guys lose. I mean, it's all three fights at the top of this card are, guys who have the biggest heaps of momentum you could have going at each other. That's what makes UFC 194 possibly the best event, maybe in UFC history, just based on that, because that's perfect matchmaking. It's all of that on one card if it stays intact. I will say this about the Rockhold-Weidman one. Part of the reason I'm not throwing Anderson, so he's done so much for this, over the 16 fight span in the UFC and everything, but when you really look at his resume, it felt like he was not facing the best guys at all times. Like he was going against guys. There was always this Anderson Silva roll over that guy. Anderson, there's stuff. Belfort at the time, so there wasn't that guy. Since Chris Weidman has been there, there's a sense that he doesn't want to just ruin everybody in the middleweight class. He wants to fight John Jones. He's saying these things out loud. He's doing this. Here comes Luke Rockhold from a different, he was in Strikeforce. He comes from a whole different angle with the exact same mindset, essentially, which is that he's the best in the sport. He wants to take on all comers. That you get the feeling he would not want to duck anybody or whatever, and you put those two guys together, that's what makes it very special. Like Anderson Silva, even when he was getting ready to fight Chris Weidman, which they didn't really want, if you recall, they were like, he's too green, he doesn't have enough fights. What about Kung Lee? That's right. You know what I'm saying? Like there was a lot of suggestion in play there. But these two guys, you get the feeling that they're so monofocused that they want to fight each other because they want, they have to be the greatest. And I think that's what's fun about it.
You spoke to Luke, right?
I did speak to Luke, yeah.
What was it felt like he was fired up, more so than usual, basically.
Well, him, he's very casual in how he says these things. But at the same time, yes, he is. And he's one of those guys who's very obsessive with how he, studies his opponents and in what he thinks of himself in terms of how he performs and what he's going to do. And he just, went through he was basically responding to the Chris Weidman comments on the MMA Hour. But it just seemed like the niceties were going to go away for a while. He was down to business, which was fun because then suddenly this is a real thing. There's a real guys going at each other. And I just felt like his mindset was, to go in there and do exactly like if you took the counterpoint of Chris Weidman, his mindset was exactly the same.
This top two fights in this card are so great because they're four alphas. Yeah. They're all in their prime. Yeah. They're all in their prime. Weidman's 31, just turned 31. Luke Rockhold's 30. Aldo is like 28, I think, and McGregor is 27. I think I have that correct.
Aldo 28?
Yeah, I
Holy
think so.
moly.
Yeah. He's been around forever, but he's still a young guy. I mean, he has a little more MMA mileage on him than probably the other three, but still, in his prime. I mean, at least, once he overcomes that injury, he's still a young guy and still does amazing things when he fights. And I think, too, he's always been a guy who does his best work when he's faced with the biggest challenges. I think, like Anderson Silva, he tends to get a little bored when he looks at a guy and says, I know I'm better than him. So he can play with his meal before he eats it. Yeah. And I think he knows. I don't think he feels like he can do that against Conor McGregor. I think he wants to beat him and embarrass him. So I really expected him to be at his best. So I'm really way more intrigued with the Aldo McGregor fight. I think for a lot of people, it's like after having the letdown of having pulled away from us at the last moment, hit you right here, didn't it?
It does. Maybe I'm not ready to get
exactly. You're not ready to invest yourself. Yeah. You want to wait till they get to fight week or something, right? Now, don't get me wrong. Weidman Rockhold is an amazing matchup. I mean, maybe the best matchup, UFC middleweight title matchup ever. Mm-hmm. Just when you talk about two guys, a champion and a challenger, both in their prime, both performing incredibly well. I mean, we saw what Rockhold did against the guy that Weidman had his problems with in Lyoto Machida. Rockhold, threw him out like yesterday's paper. It was an amazing thing to see. And so having those four guys in the prime, I mean, that's why two best title matches on a card, I think be difficult to disagree.
And the great contrast, too, between the two guys who really despise each other in the main event, and then the other two guys, as we described, being having some friendliness, but the friendliness is going to be set aside. I mean, we're not going to see these guys go out and hug each other in the middle of the cage like we've seen sometimes in fights where two buddies or training partners go out there and they give the hug. And I love it at the end of the fight, but I don't want to see it in the middle. We're not going to see that in this one. These guys are going to be all business. but it's going to be business. That's all it's going to be. Whereas the other one, it feels like it's personal. It feels like it's, it feels like that little piece of Jose Aldo will die if he loses to Conor McGregor.
The great photographer Will Fox has a photo of Weidman and Rockhold together in Australia prior to Rockhold Bisping, and they were friends. Like they're arm around each other, whatever. I feel like come December 12th, they won't even touch gloves before. I feel like this thing is going to keep building, building, and I'm really looking forward to that fight. Now the UFC has changed course, unlike International Fight Week this year and last year, where they put a show after the mega event. They would put on a Sunday show after the Saturday mega event, which always felt like we were sticking around at the party way too long. You'd show up on Sunday, everyone feels like they're hungover from the action, especially this year with what we saw between Rory McDonald and Robbie Lawler. This year, or not even this year, for this event, for whatever reason, they're putting the tough finale on the Friday night before UFC 194. How do you guys feel about this? A, do you like the idea of putting the show, if you're going to put two that weekend in the same city, on the Friday before the Sunday? And B, would you prefer that card just be left alone in the sense that all eyes are on it leading up to it? Of course, no one's going to spend more time on Evan Dunham versus Joe Lozon as opposed to UFC 194, but there is something to be said for, muddying the water, so to speak. Does it bother you at all that they're doubling up that weekend, or does it make good business sense?
I don't know. It doesn't bother me. That's for. It would have bothered me a lot more if they'd put this on a Sunday, though. Like you said, I think that given that it's the TUF 22 finale, I'm sort of like, in my mind, the TUF franchise being where it's at, it just sort of staggers along. Them reinventing it and all that. It doesn't really do much for me anymore. Anyway, I don't know how other fans feel about it, but you got a pretty good couple of fights at the top of that. It's a perfect table setter, really. I mean, if you're going to do it and you're going to tie it into something that's a nice little aperitif, I guess, like to have right before the main fight. You'd mentioned this, I think, when they did the summer International Fight Week. You have so many fans there anyway that are going to be going to the main fight, which is UFC 194. Why not bring them in? Because at this point, all those fans can then take in two cards. Or you have a built-in crowd there that's going to go to these fights. So in my mind, it's like, why not do it this way? You got a guy like Joe Lozon who wins all the in-and-out. I mean, it's just sort of a fun table setter for the main event.
I like the fact that they listened to us. I mean, we insisted that they were doing the wrong thing by having these fights on a Sunday, and they listened to us.
You're taking credit for this.
Not personally, I think it's collective.
I think we should give it to Luke. Luke gets all credit for everything.
I think it's a collective thing. Well,
he booked that Mendes fight.
Yeah, and to me, it's nice that they did move it before, but I don't know how much attention it will get. But I'm not going to pass up an opportunity to see Joe Lozon fight. I like watching that guy fight. So.
But you're a biased Massachusetts guy.
I am a biased, and I like his accent. I mean, I lived in the Boston area for 20 years, and I never could develop that accent. So but I like listen to him talk and watching him fight.
How do you feel about it? Indifferent.
There's the Mike Chiappetta we know about.
I shudder to ask you how many pay-per-views.
He hates the way that's why.
I mean, scheduling issues to me. I mean,
he still has to get his feet wet in this business. These are the kinds of things that we get all up in arms
As a reporter, when you're going there, it's great. One less day I have to stay there. I get to go home on Sunday as per usual. Wonderful.
But it's more work leading up.
That's the best.
It's more work
but
leading
fine.
up.
I'd rather have more work leading up and get home on the Sunday. But that's a pretty selfish view of it.
Sure.
But yeah, no. But I mean, it's taking advantage of the captive audience, which is smart. They're already there. They're looking to spend money on UFC related things. Why not give them another card? I mean, it just makes sense. I completely get it.
What I would do is load up that Friday night show with all the Irish fighters. Don't put any of them on Saturday. I would have put Gunnar Nelson versus Damian Maia, the fight that the Irish fans really want to see in Dublin, which is not going to happen because of Maia's staph infection. You put that on Friday, ensuring that all the Irish fans are going to buy tickets for the Friday show because they're there already that weekend. They might be spending a line and say, like, I'm going to skip it. You get them all to attend the show on Friday.
What are you trying to get all their beer money or something? Come on.
I'm just saying, doesn't that make more sense? They're all going to go to Saturday's show, the Conor show.
It's nice that it's tied in with Conor McGregor on both sides of it, too, because Conor McGregor, obviously being a coach on TUF 22, you can at least market it through the whole thing that these things are all happening on one weekend through Conor McGregor.
Yeah, well, it's going to be, that's a pretty crazy stretch with the stadium show, mid-November, and then they end the year with that Fox show.
Can I say one thing on that?
Yes, please.
It's crazy that over the last couple of years, there were a lot of people, and I know websites, et cetera, that said that the sport was sort of plateauing and it reached this gray area where it's like, well, what happens now? I mean, we've had all of our stars, they've had their boom period, and now it's going away. And here we are talking about possibly, like UFC 194 possibly being one of the best cards ever assembled, and then a stadium show that the UFC thinks that they can get 70,000 people, whether they do or not. But it's kind of crazy, the 180 to the sport. You go through these highs and lows in the sport so much that's one of those. You look at it, something, you step back and you think, wow, how do we get back to here? You know, suddenly we have a transcendent star in Ronda Rousey. A couple years ago, there was no women's division. It's just what a crazy ride.
And
the
then
UFC
UFC 200, which is going to be a mega event in a new stadium, just 11 months away. So what you're saying is the demise of MMA has been greatly exaggerated.
100%.
That's why I came back. I misread the tea leaves there.
What about this bandwagoner? Jumps off the ship and now here he is, just in time. Amazing.
Car back on the highway.
Okay, so let's quickly talk about Rumble Johnson, because this has been a story that has been developing for the last year or so. Indefinitely suspended by the UFC due to allegations. His past coming to the forefront. Some accusations. Is able to bypass that, dodges that bullet, and gets his title fight. Gets a nice little run, of course, main eventing that show in Sweden, gets his title fight, loses to Daniel Cormier. Is supposed to fight, as of right now, still scheduled to fight at UFC 191, September 5th against Jimmy Manuwa. But a strange situation pops up this week where he goes on Twitter, on Facebook, link to his Twitter feed, goes and writes about this incident with this woman at his gym. Since then, he has apologized. Since then, the UFC says that they are investigating it. Since then, it appears as though he has deleted all mentions of this altercation. And to be honest, guys, I don't really know what to say about this other than that we should probably mention it because the UFC has addressed it and they are investigating it. But, this is a guy who has this history, he has this past, and we're not here to say that he hit anyone or anything like that, and it's not a he said, she said, because he's the one that's bringing it up. How do we make sense of it? Is this a guy who should not be on social media for his own good? I mean, what's your takeaway from where things stand right now?
Well, the first thing to me that sticks out about it is, like you said, this is something he put forth himself.
Yeah.
This is nothing anybody prompted him. Nobody asked him a question about it. It was something that he brought up. And to me, it sounds like somebody who has a problem with anger issues. Like, I don't know, maybe this is a isolated incident, but we know he has a past, so it's hard to say that it is, right? Particularly with women, which, as the UFC has said, they have a zero tolerance policy. Now, he essentially admitted to an assault. Now, it's not a felony assault. Pulling out a yoga mat from under someone's feet while they're on it is still an assault. Like, you can hurt somebody by doing that. Obviously, we don't have the tape. We don't see exactly how it happened. Maybe she had 1 foot off. I don't know. We don't know the exact specifics. But that is still, you can be charged with assault for that. So the UFC and their no tolerance policy is going to be put to the test here. Now, I'm glad that they addressed it in some way and they said they're looking into it. Great, good step. Now let's see what comes of it. But Anthony Johnson is a guy he's got to start watching himself. He's got to start watching his temper, because that seemed like a really irrational response to like a pretty innocent situation. Okay, dude, we understand you're in the gym. For you, that's work. For everybody else, maybe that's how they like to spend their time working out. Somebody doing yoga, you don't see them as being an intense athlete like yourself. I get that, but it's still a person who maybe has the same right to the space that you do. So just to be civil and rational doesn't seem like a crazy response. So I just hope that he starts to examine himself, because as we said, the timeline of this, he not only was so angry that he did this, he had time to, either go home or sit somewhere and think about it. He still decided to write it, not realizing he was in the wrong. And then he still decided to defend his actions when people were tweeting him things about it. And then he pulled it off and still defended himself, saying, I don't, my lawyers and agents asked me to take this down, but I know I didn't do anything wrong, or whatever it was. So it was, to me, it's like, where's the rational thoughts in his head about how you treat other people?
I find this incredibly illuminating. I guess I not to say that I'm happy that it happened, but in some part of me, it was very helpful for me to see this unfold. Over the last couple years or so, we've seen Anthony Johnson portray himself and act as a polite, soft-spoken gentleman. Even inside the octagon, after he beat Gustafsson, he went over and consoled him. His entire demeanor in the sport has been very has been very soft-spoken and polite. And yet we kept hearing about this past, not just accusations, but an actual conviction. The first, I think there were 3 different cases, one of which resulted in conviction. The other 2 resulted in charges being dropped. But we know, anybody who knows anything about domestic abuse knows that charges are dropped all the time when women choose not to pursue them. And that's just something that happens. So we know that he has had this past, and yet we see this gentlemanly guy coming out. It was kind of always seemed like a contradiction. Now we see, in his own words, it wasn't just this woman going on Facebook and telling her story that we could say, well, let's hear his side. We heard his side, and his side is ugly. And I find that an illuminating thing. It tells me a lot more about this guy. And I think the UFC needs to take some action against him. I think the UFC, if this was some other guy, name any other athlete on the roster, and was this isolated incident, maybe you have a talking to the person. But this is a guy who has, 3 different domestic abuse situations in his past, one of which resulted in a conviction. I think that this thing's if there is a zero tolerance policy, then they have to take some action.
And by the way, when you say action, what do you mean? Do you mean releasing him? Do you mean taking him off UFC 191, fining him? What comes to mind?
I would think that at least not competing at 191 would be in order, because it's coming up really fast.
Yeah.
I imagine they're going to have some kind of an investigation that's ongoing, and if they figure out, I'm not sure how much you investigate now. He's basically told you what happened, and if it was anything worse than that, even what he said is bad enough, but it could be worse.
I just think that there might be 2 sides to Anthony Johnson. There might really be 2 sides to him. He came from a broken family. I don't know how much you guys know his backstory. His grandma was a huge role model in his life, raised him. If you talk to him about his grandmother, it's like he's talking about God. And then he gets himself in this situation. I would say that the thing that stands out is what you're saying is that the oblivion with which this action was. To not only have the thing happen, but then to go on there and call her names, to call her fat, whatever, ugly. And all that sort of thing. That's a different level of thinking. That's something that doesn't have a filter. That's really strange, and that's what strikes me about it, especially given that he's heard so much about his, he's had his past, and he's had so much criticism about that past, not just from the UFC has suspended him, but from fans. It's always in the media, people talking about what his sort of past discretions. So for him to go on there and do that with no sense that this might be injurious to himself, or that this is a bad look, or that his actions may actually require some inward thought process. It's just really crazy. I'd say illuminating is another word for it. I mean, it might tell you something about Anthony Johnson. It's just not reaching him that what he's doing is wrong in these situations.
Yeah, we're not talking about some of the other abuse situations we've heard about in the sport. Like we could have told you that War Machine and Chrissy Mack's relationship was going to end badly. We knew beforehand. We just knew who this guy was. It was not a surprise what happened in that scenario. But this is something where this is a guy who you see him interview, you see him interact with people. He doesn't appear to be a guy who would be out there abusing people. But then we hear about this.
And you have to, just to kind of take the other side for just a second, maybe he's tried to work on himself. Maybe, when we see him in the past couple of years doing these interviews, being more of a gentleman, being apologetic about things he's done wrong in his life up until now, maybe he really has tried to change and improve himself. But, sometimes you fall back. Sometimes you fall off the wagon, or something, whatever problem you have, sometimes it reverts. Its ugly head kind of pops up again.
Right.
So maybe it's the case of that, not to excuse it,
right.
But let's hope he's made some changes, and he's gonna learn his lesson, because he did apologize a little more sincerely, I think, this time, or this most recent one, and maybe he really did think to himself, or maybe someone explained it to him, and hopefully he'll learn an actual lesson. Maybe it's a lesson that has to be taught through the UFC's a penalty, but hopefully he has worked on himself in the past, and he'll continue to.
If he can. As Chuck said, maybe there's just 2 guys. It's almost like Husmar Palhares, who is also this, gentlemanly, quiet, soft-spoken, seems like a really nice guy, and then he gets your leg in a lock, and he's not going to let it go. And people keep saying, well, they should penalize him, but it keeps happening over and over and over again. And after a while, you have to think, well, Palhares just doesn't let go because he can't. He just is incapable of, he's not thinking, I'm going to hurt this guy. It just is an involuntary reaction. And maybe that's what Rumble Johnson was doing, involuntary reaction to a scenario where somebody was not doing exactly what he wanted him to do.
Maybe, but the stakes here are much larger because in a fight, we can take Paul Harris's license away, but Anthony Johnson still has to live among the wider world. So hopefully, like he starts to gain some inward reflection. The people around him, whoever advises him, and those kinds of people, are going to do the right thing by him and explain to him how to improve himself.
I'll say this about Anthony Johnson, the public figure. I mean, covering his career for quite some time now, he used to be a pretty surly interview. I mean, remember when he had those weight problems? He would never accept any kind of responsibility. It was always very combative towards the media. And then something happened, as you mentioned, after all this happened, a year and a half or so ago, he's become incredibly pleasant to talk to, right? I mean, you mentioned the Gustafsson thing. Remember, he just lost a title fight to Daniel Cormier, and he asked Dana White to put the belt around his waist. He saw Daniel Cormier at International Fight Week. They had this Ultimate Media Day. He went up to him, hugged him. I mean, it was shocking to see just how pleasant and nice. And even after the fight, interviewing him in the locker room, he had an amazing sense of the whole thing. I mean, he was just so positive afterwards. And it was refreshing. I was like, wow, Anthony Johnson really turning things around. And you see this stumble. It's unfortunate. And you hope that the right decision is made afterwards. I truly feel like sometimes, it's not the first time, it won't be the last time, social media is a really dangerous tool. And if he didn't have this at his fingertips,
but it's still,
he's incriminating himself. And I'm not saying that that's, the big takeaway here, because he still did what he did, but sometimes people just have to understand the way they're presenting themselves to the world.
Yeah, I mean, we're human. We stumble, we make stupid decisions. When we're angry, sometimes we lash out when we shouldn't. But you've got to take the steps to apologize, to correct yourself, to make yourself a better person.
Anger management is a serious thing. It's something that you can't really diagnose, much like depression in many ways. I mean, it's a constant battle. And, you just hope, this is a talented guy in the cage, but you hope that he figures it out sooner rather than later. I want to ask you guys something about something Brock Lesnar said on ESPN SportsCenter. A throwaway comment that turned into the news of the day a couple of days ago. Brock Lesnar at Bristol, promoting SummerSlam, which is taking place in my neck of the woods, Brooklyn, on Sunday, going up against the UFC in Saskatoon. That's going to be an interesting battle. Brock Lesnar's there, who has become a darling of ESPN. He's always doing media there, breaking news there. He mentions that Vince McMahon is a better promoter than Dana White, and he knows that Dana White is going to be bothered by this comment, but Vince is better. This right here, Mike Chiappetta, is a man who worked for Vince McMahon. I know not directly, but used to work at WWE. I know you hate when I bring this up, but them's the facts.
Yes.
Were you the Undertaker?
He was the fake Undertaker.
I was a jobber.
What'd you make of this comment? I mean, this is a debate that's been happening for the past, but is it apples and oranges? What'd you make of it?
Brock Lesnar siding with his employer?
Yes,
oh
yes.
my goodness, stop the presses. I mean, in a sense, I don't feel like it's fair to judge them because they're at such, Vince has been promoting for 30 plus years. Dana's still, he's been doing it for a while, but it's not really fair.
15.
I mean, it's a long time. It's a good amount, like a sample size, sure, but Vince has had a much longer run. Can Dana do this long? I mean, it's hard to compare. There's two completely different things, even though obviously they're both dealing in the pay-per-view field. But in the world of WWE, I mean, you can literally manufacture a storyline. You can make it up. You can create a star. You can, you have so much more. You can kind of take the product in the direction you want without really much filter and any outside interference. Whereas in the UFC and MMA, I mean, there's so many more intangibles that you have to account for, from injuries, trying to take shows to parts of the world that don't want you. People retiring, steroids, drugs, all these different things that could sidetrack a big fight. So to me, it's like an apples and oranges thing. But of course, Brock's going to side with Vince. He's getting paid by him.
I'm not asking so much
Anybody
about.
pays me $5 million, $8 million.
I'm not asking so much
I'll
about
say whatever
his
they want
comment,
about
just
them.
the debate. Who do you guys think is the better promoter?
Well, it's Vince McMahon should be, if you're going to compare Vince McMahon to someone, compare him to P.T. Barnum.
Yeah.
These are guys who took a show and it's a show they created, a show they script.
I don't want to interrupt, but I have a feeling a lot of our younger viewers don't even know who P.T. Barnum is. So please explain.
Well, have you heard of Ringling Brothers and Barnum and Bailey Circus? It's a different circus than the WWE, but basically it's also a circus, just like the WWE is theater. It's something that he doesn't need to find the two fighters and put them together and hope that the storyline works out. As Mike says, he creates the storyline. He says, you're going to go out there and do this, and you're going to go out there and lose, and this is so. Of course, it's a far. In some ways, it's a different job. It's not even, they're not doing the same thing. Dana White works in sports. That's one thing that's different between him and McMahon. Dana White is trying to compete with all the big sports. You know, he's competing with Roger Goodell and all the promoter, all the commissioners of different sports. I know he's not a commissioner. I know that's one of your pet peeves. But he's basically acting as a de facto commissioner of his sport. Because he's running the biggest organization in it, and that's a whole different animal than running what is essentially a traveling circus.
I tend to disagree because I think honestly, when you really look at what they're doing, which is, let's just start with the pay-per-view model. You're essentially manipulating enthusiasm and sustaining enthusiasm. It's just you have different, their spirit is different for each thing. Like you said, Dana White is in an actual sport. He's selling at root the literalness of fighting. Like he's selling something that's nonfiction, whereas you've got the other guy who's got the puppet strings on something that's fiction, right? But he's sustaining enthusiasm and building enthusiasm through that. They've been very effective at it, both sides of it, of understanding that gray area where the promoter can actually bleed into one another with completely different, end goals essentially as to what you're selling. But they use the same techniques, essentially, the same motivations, which is just to draw enthusiasm to a person and sustain it and to keep putting a dangling carrot out in front of the next one and the next one and the next one. That's what Dana White has learned to do. Manipulate gray space, to tell you, like, if people are going one way, he'll give you something else. Obfuscation, they both use this stuff very effectively. So they're, in promoter world, just promoting, they're very similar. It's obvious that Dana White got a lot from Vince McMahon, just and how he ran his business and how he's got it to where it is. Is he as good as Vince McMahon? Well, Vince has been doing it longer, and he was the blueprint, so I'm still going to side with Vince McMahon on this.
Brock probably forgot about the World Bodybuilding Federation and the XFL. Vince didn't promote those very well.
However, there's also, this to be said, I mean, Vince doesn't really go out there and promote anymore. I mean, you don't really see him, like, Dana is a promoter in the, the exact definition.
He doesn't promote as much as he used to.
Not as much, but Dana's more Bob Arum, Don King back in the day, or an Oscar De La Hoya. Vince doesn't really do. Vince is more now of like who knows what he really does.
He's in the earpiece.
He's more of like a creative director in a sense, or a producer in a sense. But I guess you could go back and look at.
He's like a showrunner on TV. I mean, he's basically a puppet master behind the strings. He's got his hands in literally everything. He is so hands-on. So Dana's the same way. Dana
sure
wants to check every little thing, from what a T-shirt looks like to the
music.
Trailer, the walkout music, all that stuff. So they're very similar.
I think you can safely argue that in the history of promotion, sports entertainment promotion, they are in the top 5, right? I mean, based on what they've done, they have to be in the top 5.
History of what promotions?
Sports and entertainment.
Oh, okay.
What do you think?
I thought you said sports promotions. I was going to chew you out for
a double.
Well, just for saying if you were saying sports promotion, then we wouldn't have Vince McMahon in there. But if we're saying yes, I gotcha.
As far as just promoters, I mean, Dana, Vince, Don King, Bob Arum, P.T. Barnum. I don't know if he fits into that. I mean, just being a promoter is something in its own right. I think it's an interesting debate because, disagreeing with you, I think UFC and WWE are more alike than UFC and NFL. The way MMA is structured is a lot more similar to pro wrestling as it is any other sport, because it's these organizations where you can only really fight. They're independent contractors, but you can only compete for those organizations. They're building stories. They're building characters. I mean, a lot of the people, the biggest stars in UFC today are straight out of a WWE storyline.
I agree with that to some extent, but on the other side of it, Vince McMahon has this roster of people, and he can manipulate the parts however he chooses. Dana White can manipulate the parts to some extent, but these guys have to, if Conor McGregor didn't go out and beat Chad Mendes, that whole storyline, that storyline that he was creating by building Conor up, just completely goes away.
Absolutely, yeah.
And Vince McMahon can make sure that if Conor McGregor was a pro wrestler, He would never lose.
Or how about
Vince McMahon could have Ronda Rousey fight Floyd Mayweather.
Sure.
He can do that.
Given that, Dana White, you look at his task and where he's brought the sport to, at this point, is pretty crazy to think about because of that. He tries to control the narrative as much as Vince McMahon can control his. He tries to improve the narrative to be what he needs it to be, but he also has to mend it on the fly at all
He's got to be ready
times.
to pivot all the time.
They're
'cause
rolling the
essentially
dice every time
They
out.
are the same in that they're selling stories. I mean, they sell stories and they sell characters. Whether it's the Conor McGregor as a character or the story of McGregor, Aldo, whatever it is. I mean, that's what they're selling the fans. Like, to get you to part with your money, you have to be invested in it like that. You're not just buying a fight. I mean, if you were buying a fight, Carlos Condit would be the top-selling pay-per-view guy of all time.
Sure.
See how I brought that back around?
Yeah. Well, how about this? Let's bring it back this way. WWE went to that same stadium. It wasn't called Etihad Stadium. It was called something else back then. In around 2002, WWE went there for a show called Global Warning, which wasn't on TV here in the United States. It was a straight-to-DVD release, and they sold 57,000 seats. That was their big debut there. So much like the UFC is trying to do 13 years later, WWE already put it out there. How about that?
2002?
Yeah, 2002.
That means I was there and I don't remember that.
You were at the show?
No, I was
you
at
were working
the-
for the
I was-
company.
yeah.
You don't remember this? Brock was there, Rock was there, maybe even Stone Cold. You tried to turn it around altogether. I do the same, tie it all together. How about that? Okay, one more topic before we go. Let's end on this. The UFC is back on a special Sunday, right? How about this?
Big time.
In the Paris.
Saskatoon is
I
in
think-
the room.
Yes. I think it was called the Paris of North America or the Paris of Canada or something like that. Either way, it's wrong. It's Rough Rider country to me.
And then
It's-
Paris, Texas of...
Yes, exactly. Saskatoon,
Rough
Saskatchewan.
Riders 2 words or Rough Riders 1 word? I know there were 2 different teams that
I
had the
think-
same nickname, but one was 2 words,
Yes,
one was 1
Ottawa,
word.
who's no longer with us, they're now called the Red Blacks.
Oh.
But I believe the Saskatchewan Rough Riders are one word.
Love the CFL beat. This is a great...
Yes, it's a great. We can talk about Michael Sam, anything you want, the Alouettes. So it's Charles Oliveira versus Max Holloway. Which one of these two guys interests you more going into this fight? Because Max Holloway, super young. I mean, he's just like, I think he's like 23 or 24. 23, which is amazing. He still looks like a baby.
He's been around for
Made that debut against Dustin Poirier on short notice, lost that, and stumbled against Conor McGregor. That's his last loss. Had an unbelievable performance against Cub Swanson, really a coming out party here in Newark not that long ago. And then you have Charles Oliveira, who, if you recall, when he came into the UFC, people were calling him like the John Jones of the lightweight division. I mean, he had a lot of hype. He has stumbled as well with weight and other things, but has looked very good as of late. I'm wondering which one of these two guys actually interests you more, because I feel like they are on the verge of something special, yet every time we get excited, maybe you have to kind of curb your enthusiasm.
I think this question
Yeah.
also drags us back to the WWE versus UFC
Let's hear it.
thing, because the answer is whoever goes out there and performs. I mean, if this was a Vince McMahon production, we would already know. Well, okay, Charles, sorry, but we want to push Holloway, and he's the guy that's going to. But we don't know. Dana White can't do that. Dana White says, I got these 2 guys who are both rising and rising and rising. They've had their troubles. We got great stories with both the guys. Now we're going to find out which guy is going to keep going. And so to me, the answer is not, I'll pick this guy or that guy as the great story. This great story is that whoever beats the other one is the one.
It's strange.
Well done.
How about that?
Well done. Paul Heyman would like that.
That's what P.T. Barnum would say.
I'm not 100% sure, but this might be the first time that Charles Oliveira is the actual elder in the cage. I mean, like, this is one of those things. He's only 25 years old, but we know Holloway is 23. So it's a very strange thing. They've had similar careers in some ways, except for Oliveira, I think, was really thrown to the wolves immediately. You know, he's facing guys like Frankie Edgar. Frankie Edgar. And Cub Swanson early on. He was fighting those kinds of guys at 21, 22 years old. And so he went through a few bumps. I feel like he's gotten very wise as to how to approach the fight game, including in the weight cutting and stuff, which I guess we'll see how that continues to play out. But to me, he's got a little more riding on him, because I feel like he's been in that spotlight a little longer than the other guy. Who are we talking about?
Max Holloway?
Max Holloway.
Yes.
I was about to say so Holloway. But Holloway has looked so good in his last fights that and the fact that he's still the only one to go the distance with Conor McGregor is still sort of like this silver lining for him, even though McGregor had the knee injury and all that stuff. But so to me, it's an interesting fight. You have 2 guys that are basically in the same spot, but I feel like Charles Oliveira should be the one who's a little bit ahead of the curve right now.
I think this is a fight where you have to give the tip of Chuck's cap to Sean Shelby, just because you don't have to match these guys up. I mean, they're 2 young guys, kind of both rising at the same time, you're going to need contenders pretty soon after Aldo and McGregor fight. You're going to need contenders pretty soon. So, in a sense, like, you don't need one of these guys knocking the other off. But that's the difference between this and some other promotions and other sports where it doesn't matter. Like, we just have to find out who's better now. And so, to me, like, I just like the matchmaking of it. To me, the matchmaking is more interesting and intriguing than who am I more excited about? Because kind of like Jeff said, I mean,
I'm happy you mentioned that. I'm happy you mentioned that because I definitely feel like Sean Shelby is like the most overlooked employee at Zuffa, as far as the one that we see, the fruits of his labor. Because even when people talk, and even Dana, to be honest, when they talk about the flyweights and the featherweights, I always feel like they say Joe Silva. And as those who follow the sport closely know, Sean Shelby is responsible for 145, 135, 125, and also 135 women and 115 women. And I think he puts on, I mean, just you look at what he did with Conor, the way he built him up, what he's done as of late with Max Holloway, it's a great point. It's a nice little, that's a nice little nod to Sean, because I often feel, I mean, again, Sean is the one who signed Ronda Rousey. I bring this up a lot. People get mad at me for this, but it wasn't Scott Coker. It was the Zuffa era that signed Ronda Rousey, and it was Sean Shelby in particular that signed her. So he deserves a lot of credit for that, in my opinion. A lot of credit for his work as of late, and I'd like to see him get noticed.
Yeah. He doesn't want to see
You
it.
did it.
He hides behind bushes and things like that on his Twitter account.
He's also if we want to go on a Sean Shelby rant, also the one who put together the Bob O'Reilly video, the original Bob O'Reilly video, and on top of all that, he's Tom Brady's cousin. Did you guys know that?
No.
You didn't know that?
I think I knew
you
that.
knew that.
Wow, you took me up here. I was with you, and then you just said that.
I was
like,
say,
no thanks.
I think we've
thanks.
crested the mountain.
So we've got Sean Shelby, Vince McMahon. What
Who's the better
do we got?
promoter? Gosh, that's a tough one. Tune in next week. Luke Thomas will weigh in on that one.
I think we're done now.
Yeah,
His back is hurting even more right now.
Yeah, he's counting his lucky stars.
I understand why his
his
back hurts, because I'm done carrying you guys. Let's go.
That's right. Well, welcome back. Does it feel good to be back?
It's great.
Yeah? You missed the
enjoy
MMA Beat? Not the show.
I'm back a couple of,
You only been back once. Any truth to the rumor that your sort of one-off appearance on this show is what led to you getting this new job?
It's like the drug dealers giving you a first taste for free.
And then you're just back. Here we go. When did you start, by the way?
September 1st.
September 1st.
Keep your pants on, unlike some of your colleagues over there.
I look forward to visiting the
Can't
site.
wait to see the hate, people. Thank you.
I look forward to visiting the site for the first time once you make your debut on September 1st. Should be a lot
Whatever
of fun.
brings the people in, that's fine.
That is right. All right, we're out of time. Gotta go. We're back next week. That is great news. Again, speedy recovery to our colleague Luke Thomas. Hope you enjoyed the show. Hope you enjoyed the fights this Sunday from Saskatoon. Looking forward to talking about that and a whole lot more next week. For now, we say goodbye. That is Mike. That is Jeff. That is Chuck. I am Ariel. Thanks again for watching. We'll see you next week.